Niin kokeillaan sinne. No nyt kuuluu. Is it working?
Let's see. Yeah, it sounds like it is.
So welcome everyone. So this is Ben Orlin. He's written a new book called Math for English majors in English, and we translated it, or rather I translated it as Matematiikkaa runoilijoille. And now we are gathering here to kind of like celebrate a little, the moment of this great moment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and thank you. Good to see you all. Thank you all for coming and hanging out, and thank you for letting me blunder along speaking English in a country that has many other languages.
Yeah. So Ben, you wrote a book. It's called Universaalin kielen inhimillinen puoli, the human side of the universal language. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. In English, a human take on the universal language.
Human take that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right. Take being a very online sort of word, right? It's sort of. Yeah. I sort of liked the contrast between a book, which takes ages to write and long time to print, and is a very slow process to read, and then the idea of that being a take, which usually one pictures a take as being something online that's about 20 words long and gets you angry. What the human side, human take on the universal language. So math is often hailed as this universal connective thing, right? This thing that is shared by all human cultures. Everyone has mathematics. It's the same mathematics everywhere, right? And this goes back at least to Galileo and probably much further. One of Galileo's famous lines is talking about the cosmos as a great book, and mathematics is the language in which this book is written. And the symbols in this book are triangles and circles and the figures of geometry. And that's a lovely thought, and many people have written about that. But I was interested in a more prosaic, like a simpler side of math, which is, it really is, you write it on the page, and I'm a teacher, I've taught at all different ages. Students, they get frustrated by what's written on the page. They don't know what they're supposed to do with it. They have trouble just understanding what is it we're doing when we have conversations with mathematics. And so I wanted to do a book. This is my third that's in Finnish now. A book that was a little different from the others, which really focus on the ideas of mathematics and ignore the symbols, the equations, the language. And in my earlier books, I tried to step around that stuff. And this book, I wanted to say, no, that's what they get caught on with mathematics. That's what angers them. That's what alienates them. That's what kind of intrigues them sometimes. So I wanted to talk about the experience of a human trying to learn math as a language.
Yes, and you mean math as an actual language. So it's not like it's not a metaphor.
That's right.
It's an actual language.
That's right. Yeah, everybody I would describe this book to would say, "Oh, that's interesting. Math. You're comparing math to a language. It's sort of a metaphor. Math as language." And I kept having to say, "No. I literally mean math as a language, like English, like Finnish." And so the book is full of these connections to English, saying, "Okay, well, in English, nouns work like this." And in math, it's pretty similar, but a little different. So here's how nouns work in math. Which made it a very tricky book to translate, I think, because it's full of these connections to specific phrases and structures in English.
Yeah, I had to think quite a lot about how this is how it relates to English grammar. So let's see how it relates to Finnish grammar. I had to brush up on my grammatical expertise.
Right, sentence diagramming.
Exactly.
And all that,
yeah. So what caught my attention when I started, first read this book, you talk about how most books about mathematics are somehow translations from mathematical language to this natural language, and they're like prose translated from that, like equations to...
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would always, one of my favorite reactions I would get from mathematicians when they would read my first book. So my first book, right, is back here, Math with Bad Drawings. And it's all about places math shows up in sort of surprising real-world settings. So, the mathematics of lottery tickets, or the mathematics of scaling and size, and how it explains sort of the different forms of animals. And things like that, why large animals are sort of different in structure than small animals. And whenever I'd see a mathematician reading a paragraph, often they would sort of scowl at it because it wasn't phrased in traditional mathematical language. It was in very conversational, everyday, joke-filled language. And they would sort of scowl and frown, and then they'd turn away and go, yeah. They were sort of doing this translation back into mathematics of what I'd written, and they had to compile like a computer. And then once they saw, oh yes, I approve of that, and then they would go back to it, which I was always glad. I got a lot of nods of approval that way, because I think mathematicians were used to seeing that translation go a little bit wrong. And I think most attempts to popularize mathematics, that's what you have to do as a writer. You take the mathematics and you kind of step away from the equations. Famously, Stephen Hawking's editor, when he was working on A Brief History of Time, which is by no means an easy book, but his editor told him, every equation you include, we cut the readership in half. So please, no equations. So he wanted the entire book, he uses one equation, it's E equals MC squared. And the book sold 1 million copies. So I'm surprised the editor didn't say, cut that one, we'll sell 2 million copies. This could be an even bigger seller. And I'd sort of followed that same advice. Not that my editor said that in so many words, but I'd followed similar advice in my earlier books, really tried to avoid equations.
At least complicated equations.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sometimes I like doing equations. I do this with my students too, equations where instead of using variables, you just put the word. So you say, brightness equals distance, or, brightness times distance equals whatever, when you're talking about stars. So rather than, scaring people with Greek letters.
So, you talk about language. So usually, then, if mathematics actually is a language, so it should have the similar structures or consist of similar objects as any other language. So you'd expect it to have nouns.
Yeah.
You'd expect it to have adjectives, maybe pronouns.
Yeah.
Verbs.
Yeah.
Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah. And I think it does. It's a weird language. I'm not going to say it's a totally ordinary language, and that you can raise your child speaking math as a first language and they'll get by okay. Math is a good third language, I think. But yeah, so math does have that structure. Most mathematical sentences use the same verb, and that verb is essentially the verb to be. It's equals. And so if you look at a mathematical conversation, it often looks very repetitive in structure because it's just someone saying, this is the same as that, this is the same as that, this is the same as that. And that's the entire page. Maybe if you're lucky and you're reading some spicy mathematics, some analysis maybe, you'll get inequalities. So this is bigger than that, and this is bigger than that, and this is bigger than that. So as a literature, it would seem pretty narrow. But it turns out that that's right. The nouns of mathematics, right? What are those nouns? They're quantities, right? They're the sizes of things. And so all mathematics, in some sense, is equating or comparing sizes of things, which again makes it sound like a very narrow language. That was one of the things I was reflecting on as I was writing the book. And especially thinking about, the reader I was trying to reach, sort of like an educated person, thoughtful, reading person, for whom math was never their favorite subject. It never clicked. And the usual way of reaching those people, and it's a rhetorical strategy I've done myself, is to say, oh, math is everywhere. Math is everything. You're doing math right now. You don't even know it. And it's like, no, you're not. You're not doing math right now. You're doing lots of things. You can use math to talk about everything. But part of the reason you can do that is it's a very narrow language. It's a language that turns the whole world into just simple quantities, then uses those quantities to calculate other quantities. And then algebra is just talking about that process in a very precise way. So
algebra is the grammar.
Algebra. That's the term I use in the book is the algebra. Algebra is the grammar of math. So what you're doing when you're learning math, in primary school, is sort of learning phrases almost, but you're not quite writing full sentences. Or the sentences you're writing are very simple and sort of childlike, right? 2 + 7 = 9. That is a full mathematical sentence, but it's quite a simple one. And then when you get to secondary school and you start writing with variables, that's when you start really speaking the full language, the kind of the literature of mathematics. And I think a lot of mathematicians who write books, they skip past that. They want to go right into university math and what's exciting there and the things most people never get to see in class. And I wanted to focus on the moment that I think loses a lot of people, that moment sort of right around the start of secondary math education, when suddenly the language shifts and you're dealing with a more complex grammar.
Yeah, like a good example, I used to be a math teacher, so I have some experience of where people have kind of like lost the kind of like the plot of mathematics, and one of them is like fractions. So you talk about the language of fractions and the language of decimals, and this is kind of one of those moments, I think, that many people, feel like decimals are really feel somehow cozier, but actually you end up in having kind of like a little, it's like not a different language, but maybe a little, like, to use a literary term, a little bit different discourse, maybe. Wow.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. One of the things this book pulled me to think about were not things I'd spent a lot of time focusing on in math. So there's like several chapters that are sort of all about rounding and how we think about the roundness of a number. I didn't think that would take pages to explain, but actually I found myself really interested by some weird examples. Fractions and decimals is maybe your first encounter in math with little sub-languages, where a lot of what you're doing in math is translating between these two things, turning fractions into decimals and vice versa. And then later in math, you do that with, a lot of high school math is turning geometry into algebra and vice versa. Right, turning shapes into equations, and then if you're a research mathematician, again, you're turning modular forms into elliptic. I don't know. I haven't studied advanced algebra myself, but again, those sort of translations. A lot of research math is finding the right isomorphism, a mathematician would call it, but the right translation between two ways of talking about something. And in some sense, in mathematics, most of what we do is we just paraphrase the thing we just said. And all you're doing is trying to find the simplest, clearest way to say it.
Yeah, or like when you talk about irrational numbers, like the wisest way only way to actually talk about them is not to unpack the actual number. Like square root of 2 is square root of 2, and if you start to write the decimals, you end up in a endless chore.
Yeah, that's right. That's one that captures people. Is pi sort of an object of fascination in Finland the same way it is in the U.S.? It's in the U.S. For whatever reason, and it's like an important number, but it's the one that has sort of gone viral. It's the one, if you want to really sell mathematics to someone who doesn't particularly care about it, you want to entice them with something, somehow pi, the fact that pi is irrational, that's just candy to people. I don't quite know why. And it's funny because irrationality is not a strange feature for a number. From a mathematical perspective, if you draw the number line, and if you pick a random number along there, if you could throw a dart and hit somewhere on the line, essentially 100% of the numbers are irrational, right? The sort of familiar numbers like 1 and 3/4, that's like barely any of the number line. Everything is irrational. But somehow pi gets to be the celebrity for being irrational, which is, well, everybody's like that, but that's, right, you were saying about irrational numbers, yeah. But there's something about that excites people, the idea that, and it's sort of cool. Like, pi is in some sense an unspeakable number. You say, like, how big is it? It's like, well, it's about 3.1. Yeah. Like, well, what is it really? Well, it's not 3, but it's like 3.14.
Yeah, we have you have a poem in the book. We'll recite the poem a little later.
Yeah.
To illustrate this exact point.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I'm looking forward to, in a few minutes we can, I was hoping we could read some passages, and I would read the English original, and then Juha can read his Finnish translation. For partly because it's actually quite relevant to the theme of the book, about translation and language. But also I just find it fascinating to see how ideas change as you move them from one language to another.
Yeah, this of course poetry, or this is just maybe a limerick or something like that, more like that.
Yeah.
Maybe we could go.
Do you want to go ahead and do that?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to tell about what we're going to do.
I'll set it up. This is from maybe a third of the way through the book or so.
52.
Page 50. Okay, great. Okay, earlier than I was thinking. So it's a chapter about irrational numbers. And in particular about the fact that Right. Well, so the cultural context here, again, a challenge for a translator, is that Pi Day has become a sort of little holiday in the United States. There was someone at a museum in San Francisco about, this must have been the late 80s, I think, decided, you know what would be fun? We'll make a little holiday all around the number pi. So, in the US, you write the date, the month and then the day. So 3/14, that'll be Pi Day, March 14th. And he came up with all these strange ways to celebrate it. He's like, we'll dance around chanting the digits of pi, and we'll dance in a circle, 3.14 times around around some kind of like little shrine of pie, and we'll all eat pie, we'll have like sweet apple pie and things like that. So he made this very silly little holiday, which then over it's been 30 plus years now, has sort of been adopted by teachers across the US as a chance to not have to teach a lesson on Pi Day and to get, students to bring pies in. So it's sort of this little mathematics appreciation day. And of course, like anything, certainly in the US, I imagine in Finland too, once people get enthusiastic about something, there's always some kind of backlash. So in particular, there are professional mathematicians who are very skeptical of Pi Day, and they feel like chanting digits, that's celebrating it all wrong. Ugh, like students memorizing the digits of pi, what a huge waste of time. Which, in a sense, it is, but it's silly too.
It's certainly not as big as in the United States here, but you still have these kind of like memes circling around the math teacher forums on social media and all that.
Yeah.
But I'm not so certain that they have a lot of like Pi Day celebrations at school or something like that.
Right.
Maybe like a little thingy in the classroom, maybe.
Sure.
Some cases.
a little. Right. Well, in a more subdued Finnish sort of way, as opposed to our exuberant, over the top American celebration. Anyway, and then the other, so still more context for this one. English readers may be familiar with Dr. Seuss. He's probably the most popular children's author in the United States. But he writes very silly, playful, he passed away 30 years ago, but he wrote very silly, playful language with a lot of invented words. So I wrote and one of his most famous books, has been turned into a film, is The Grinch, about this little creature who hated Christmas. So I said, okay, we'll do The Grinch, but he's complaining about Pi Day instead of Christmas, which I probably could not have dreamed up a less translatable little thing for you to have to work on. It's like very culturally specific in multiple ways, and it's this rhyming English poem with invented words in it. So I can't judge. I mean, Juha is brilliant, so I suspect he's done a great job, but you'll have to be the judge of how well he did in Finnish of translating this. But so shall I read the English, and then you can read the...
Yeah, maybe I'll just, about the challenges regarding this. Like, there is, for example, in the original, there's this fraction there in the poem somewhere, and it's 22/7. I can't remember how it's in English, but in Finnish that would be 22/7, and to fit that in any kind of like meter, that would be a nightmare. So I had to get creative, but actually I was able to finally do it. It's the third chapter. Maybe we should...
third stanza, yeah.
Yes, stanza, yeah. So maybe we could do it like... go back and forth, like you first, and then me, and
from the beginning.
From the beginning,
sure.
So
okay, great, let's do it. Okay, so it begins, and this is taken almost directly from Dr. Seuss's book about the Grinch. Every kid in the classroom likes Pi Day a lot, but the Grinch in the faculty lounge did not.
Yeah. So the Grinch. That was the first problem. Like, what do I do with this? So what I thought that, okay, let's forget about the whole character and name him completely anew. So I called him Lehtori Nipo. But I think that it's the same kind of like archetype of a character.
I like that. Also, it changes it in this lovely way too, because I've drawn a sort of poor version of the Grinch, right, trying to imitate the Dr. Seuss style. He's very distinctive illustrations, but he's sort of this naked furry character. And now in Finnish, it's just this naked furry lecturer, sort of this angry character, covered in like the strange,
Okay, but piipäivänä oppilaat innoissaan on, mutta lehtori Nipo on onneton.
Okay, sounds good to me. So this to the Grinch was the dumbest of seasons, and asked or unasked, he would rattle off reasons. In the US, it said the date 3/14 is March the 14th. That's what Pi Day must mean. But the rest of the world gives the day, then the month. So 3/14 is the 3rd of Kerplumph, a month, I assure you, that does not exist. And that is just one of the gripes on my list.
Okay, but here we go.
Yeah, I don't know how Kerplumph translates.
Pöhkökuu. So, tuo päivä, josta nipo niin nipottaa, jos kenet hän kohtaa, hän aina niuhottaa. Suomessa päivät ilmaistaan näin ja Jenkeissä toisin, väärinpäin. Meillä päivä on ensin, vasta sitten on kuu, eikä piistä saa päivää, ei oo eikä tuu. 14. kuu, se on pöhkökuu kai, ja pöhkökuun 3. lie torjantai. Sitä kuuta ei ole, päiväkin mahdoton, mutta niuhotussyitä mulla muitakin on. So Kerplumph thank you. was pöhkökuu. That would be like a stooge month or a dumb month or something like that.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, right, because in English, Kerplumph is just a nonsense sound. Sort of, it's like kind of the sound a big rock would make going into the water. But I just needed something to rhyme with month.
But there is also a nonsense word here. It's torjantai. We have Friday, and Thursday is torstai, and Friday is perjantai. And I made this impossible day torjantai.
Nice.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So that's So I managed to somehow squeeze in the nonsense.
The nonsense. Okay. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. So it goes on. This horrible day that transfixes, and this is still all in the voice of the Grinch. This horrible day that transfixes the nation is built on a lousy approximation. 22/7 comes closer to pi, so let's wait till that date out in mid-late July.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I can read the next line too. Besides which, old pi is an artifact now. The cool mathematicians all venerate tau, which is this in the sort of online math community. There are people who argue that pi, which is the sort of the area of a circle, or it's halfway around a circle, it's the wrong number. We should really be talking about the full distance around the circle, which would be 2 pi, around 6.3, and that gets the Greek letter tau as its name. It was very dense stuff to translate.
Well, let's go and finish. Piille parempaa päivää voin ehdottaa, joka heinäkuun loppuun loksahtaa. Liki arvon se tuottaa myös lähemmän, tää 22/7. Päivä siis siirretään kesälle pois, se kouluunkin rauhan palauttaa vois.
Sounds good.
I'm quite happy. 22/7. That was a nightmare, but I was able to do it.
Right. The rhythm sounds good to me. That's all I can judge. And the Grinch goes on, and have I brought up how it eats me alive, the 3.14159.265, how it just rambles on and it fills me with hate, 358979328. 3238. I read that. I lost my own rhythm there. All those meaningless digits, the hot, wasted breath. Oh, it bores me to tears. No, it bores me to death.
Yeah. Well, this is also a tricky part for me, or was, because the English numbers are like 1, 2.
Right, all monosyllables, yeah.
Yeah, one syllable, and Finnish is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Was that
9.
is that 7?
7, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
10. So you have three syllable words. It's nightmarish. But
children must not learn to count until they're 10 or 12.
We shorten them like 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
So I use that. Ja sanoinko jo, miten harmittaa siis 3,141 ja 5. Jatkuu se vain 9, 6 ja 5. Jatkuu äärettömiin. Turha ja tolkuton numeron papatus, pitkästyn uuvuksiin, pitkästyn lakastun. He fades away in the end.
Okay.
He's so bored.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
Right. So he goes on, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Those numbers mean nothing outside of base 10. Besides which, the digits are ones no one needs. Past 30 or 40, they're useless as thneeds. Thneed is another Dr. Seuss reference. For a circle a million light years in width, your digits could stop at the mere 25th. and still you could calculate out the circumference down to the span of a nano-nonumference, a distance 1,000th the width of a hair. For digits past that, I quite simply don't care. I'm speaking the truth when I firmly assert Pi Day's an excuse to swap math for dessert.
Yeah. Okay, this wasn't that hard, or maybe it was, I can't remember anymore, but I think I got the idea here. Jaksan myös toistaa nämä numerot piin, mitään merkitse ei, jollei kantana siin. 10 O, tuo koulusta tuttu, kannoilla muilla, aivan toinen on juttu. Piin ilmaista siis voi toisinkin päin, mutta nipotusaiheet lopu ei näin. Desimaaleja piistä, jos 30kin on, tai 40 tai yli, se on tarpeeton. Keksitään ympyrä, meille kahleet ei päde, valo vuosia miljoona olkoon sen säde. Kehän tarkasti laskea piillä nyt voi, vaan tarkkuus tää tuskin tolkkua toi. Kuin paksuus vain hiuksen, sen tarkkuus on nano. Se on järjetön tarkkuus, muuta en sano. But, you know, English is a little bit, the information density in English is a little bit higher than in Finnish. Yeah. So I had to add 2 lines to this poem. this part, yeah.
Yeah, that stanza, have you finished it yet? Or?
No, the last one. Okay, Piipäivästä kaikkihan sen tajuaa, koske se lainkaan, ei matikkaa, vaan lapset ja opet päiväksi saa, miettimään vain, piirakkaa. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for taking that
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, I think it would have been totally reasonable to just write back to my publisher and say, I'm skipping that chapter. We're not doing that.
We don't do that.
Okay, no, that's very very kind. I think you should consider, I mean, I realize that mostly what Terra Cognita does is very highbrow, sort of popular science, trade science. Like my books are already sort of
These are a bit of an outlier.
My books, are at this very much at the silly end for you. But I think if you want to consider getting the rights to Dr. Seuss and trying to translate that, I think that maybe
no, I don't have the time for that. This one, I was pulling my hair with this thing. It's kind of like I'm stepping out of my comfort zone.
Right, that seems fair.
Yeah, but this still looks like there are other parts like maybe there talk about. In Finland there was this to change the subject a little bit. There was when you talk about language, there is also there's always the grammar, the kind of like the conventions, how to speak it, but there is also a style, so kind of a register of the language. So, and you have a chapter about that too. Could you tell me, tell a little about the style in language of mathematics?
Yeah, this was something I always noticed, especially when I moved from teaching high school to middle school. Is that students struggled to tell the difference between when they'd said something false in mathematics, like they'd really made an intellectual error, and when they'd just written something that was a little peculiar or unconventional, or, that's not really the way we say that. I would try to draw that distinction for them. They would have written a solution, maybe in some sort of weird format. And I'd say, well, that's not really how we write it, but you got the right answer. And they'd say, oh, so it's wrong? It's like, no, it's right what you're saying, and people would understand it if you wrote this, but it's just not quite the way we tend to write that solution. But the distinction didn't mean anything to them, because, if to them what was right was what got a 10 out of 10 and was the same as what was written in the back of the book in the answer key. And so this distinction I was drawing between, if you write one of the examples I give in the book, if you write x3, meaning x times 3, it's pretty weird. That's like it's not how we write that. We write 3x. We always put the number in front of the variable. And in fact, if you're doing 3 times x times pi, again, people will really know what you mean if you write 3x pi, but that's weird. You should write 3 pi x. That's just the standard way to write it. And so just as English and Finnish have conventions, stylistic conventions, but people will still understand you if you break those rules. Math has those too, but they're not something math teachers talk about. We tend to speak in terms of right and wrong, and say no, that's not the way to do it.
This reminds me of we talked a little earlier. I told you this story. This neuroscientist and musician Daniel Levitin was in Finland a few months back, and he had this discussion about this with this. Virtuoso bass player Billy Wooten, and Wooten told how he was Victor Wooten. and he was telling how he was 2-year-old, the youngest in his family, and his elder siblings gave him the bass, and he played it, of course, all over the place like a 2-year-old would. He didn't know the language of music.
Yeah, I think my 2-year-old would just break a bass.
Yeah,
he was
so he was playing something.
But
what the brothers did and sisters, they would somehow start to play like he was playing. In the same way as, you know, when you have kids in the family and they say something funnily cute in a cute, wrong but cute way. Like my son was a small kid, and we caught a fish with and he had the fish in his hand. And put the grill on. He shouted "kirri päälle," and after that we started calling grill a kirri. It's grilli in Finnish. So he said it wrong, but in such a cute way. So we kind of like adapted his mistake as our proper way of saying. So you know, we changed for our family. We changed the convention of speaking about grill. And so what do you think, if we consider the math to be an actual language, and learning math would be learning to read and speak mathematics, should we be more forgiving in our, or at least more sensitive when we kind of like give feedback on you know, like on writing mathematics, like writing expressions, writing calculations?
I think maybe it changes my perspective a little bit to think of it like, okay, well, I'm really a foreign language teacher here. So what does that mean to teach math as a kind of foreign language? And one thing I think it does mean is that, when you're learning a foreign language, there are often certain characteristic mistakes you make along the way. And that's just okay, that's fine. You know, or learning your first language for that matter. And that's okay. You don't stand up and speak the language in perfect, fluent, precise grammar with great pronunciation the first time you speak a new language. Maybe actually there's a story about Einstein that he didn't speak until age 4 or 5. And then the first thing he said was in precise German, "Could you please pass the peas?" So maybe if you're Einstein, maybe you just start speaking the language fluently. But everybody else, like, no, you go through, right, exactly. You say grill a little bit funny. And the people around you kind of celebrate and play with that language. So I think that's right. You know, not to say that we shouldn't teach kids the standard way to say things, course. But that there's.
But they will eventually, like you were a kid,
right,
who talked funnily at some point.
Yeah, right.
Now
of course,
you're a pretty good writer now. You know,
right. My English is fairly fluent now, which is good because none of my other languages are. I think that's right, and especially finding places for play to show that you can play with mathematical language. So one very easy place is variables. I like encouraging students to do this. That, you know, there are conventions in math. We use actually the variable x in a slightly different setting than we use the variable a. And it's weird. It's almost nonsense when you're learning it. You can't even quite explain the rule because, like, oh, x, that's a number we don't know. A, that's a number we know. You go, well, what is it? Oh, well, we don't know. It's like, well, that doesn't make a ton of sense. It's like a known unknown. X is a unknown, but there's also, well, we know we don't know it though, so it's a no. Anyway, variable names are confusing, but that's a good place for play. You can say, okay, well, let's name this variable after Juha. Juha squared plus 4 is 16. What's Juha? Who's Juha? And then we solve for what Juha is. And you can do that. You can name, you can use emojis as your variables. You don't want to do that forever because at some point that's not how mathematicians do it. But there's room for play in math, and there's well beyond naming variables. There's places to play around with what we call things. You know, I like if a student comes up with a method in class, that's that kid's method. You know, and we just celebrate that kid. You know, we cite him every time we use that method, and it sort of becomes a little part of class culture, just like your son's word for grill.
Right. But there's also this question that some of these conventions that are the ones that we have room to play with, you know.
Yeah.
And then they're kind of like the agreements. Okay, this way of writing things means this, and we could write it in a different way. But you know, we've used to doing it like this, so when we do it like this, we understand each other. But then there are mathematical laws that are different. Like there was this discussion in Finland during the Christmas, New Year's time how do you
commutative.
Commutative property of multiplication. So basically, what it means that you have a multiplication 2 times 3. It can be written also as 3 times 2, and this is a mathematical law, actually.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you can always do that. And there seemed to be a little bit of confusion in that because some kid had been assessed in an exam that it's mistaken to write this multiplication this way, but it should be written, other way around. So only 2 times 3, not 3 times 2.
Yeah. No, which is right. It was sort of always a shame to see, a teacher enforcing a vision of mathematics that's not quite what I think most mathematicians would subscribe to. I'm certainly sympathetic when primary school teachers have a lot on their plates. Not only they have to teach every subject, but they have to teach them to these insane young people. So there's a lot that goes into that job. But yeah, I think it's right. It's certainly the case that some of those students I see who have a very rigid notion of what right and wrong means in math, and a very unsubtle notion. It's like, well, if it's what the teacher says is right, then it's right. And if the teacher says it's wrong, then it's wrong. And that's what right and wrong mean in math. It's like scoring points in basketball. It's like, well, if the ball goes in, then that's good, and if it doesn't, that's bad. But it doesn't mean anything, right? Basketball, you're just trying to get the ball in the hoop. Math, similarly, it's sort of like you write things down on the page, you're just trying to score points. And so it scores points or it doesn't. That's sort of the impression that school often creates. I think partly maybe that's because math is a language that for many of us, we only, you use numbers when you're buying things. Not anymore, you just put your card down. But we only really speak it in school. There's a lot of math that's only spoken in school. So you can imagine if you had someone learning a foreign language, learning English, and they'd never seen it spoken outside of the classroom. They'd never even known anyone who really spoke it outside of the classroom. You could develop some very weird conceptions about English. You'd think like, oh yeah, it's all consists of like you say hello to someone, you ask them where the library is, and that's the whole dialogue. That's just what English speakers do a lot of. You would just get the wrong impression because school. I love schools. They're important institutions, but they're very imperfect, and schools are not the world. And math, maybe uniquely among subjects, is one that people run into in school only, and they don't see it out there in the world. And so it's easy to develop some weird conceptions about what math is and what it does, and to miss its ability to mean something.
We have a little time left. I think one more thing, talking point here. When I was reading this book, I started to think like, maybe we will talk 45 minutes, and then we have some time for questions.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But one question about this: when you started thinking about mathematics as a language, I was kind of like thinking that you might, if I look at the contents of the book, so most of these you have these kind of like. It's in 4 parts, like nouns, verbs, grammar. But then you don't really, the head. You talk about counting, measuring. So it's actually not that much. It doesn't seem to be that much about language. When you were thinking about this book, kind of like sketching it out, drafting it. So what was your kind of like? How did you start? Did you start like? What are the nouns? Or did you start like, okay, this is important in math, like multiplication. So what would that be in mathematics, like grammatically speaking? Yeah. It
started. So this book, more than any of the others I've written, actually went through a lot of iterations and a lot of change. It started out. It was going to be a sort of a playful book. Almost like a dictionary of different mathematical symbols with little silly stories and quotations and jokes about all the different symbols you run into in mathematics. And I thought I could, with that book, thread the same needle that I'd done with my earlier book, sort of speak out of both sides of my mouth to 2 different audiences. Because I think a lot of the readers that I have, in English for sure, and probably in other languages, are people who know mathematics, right? They're people who who teach it or familiar with the subject. And for them, I think my books are a pretty quick read, but they have new thoughts and new analogies and jokes and connections and little bits of history or science that maybe they weren't familiar with. And then especially for younger readers, a lot of my readers are middle school, high school students, but also for just curious adults. My books it's a heavier lift, right? It's like takes more focus to read it, but it's still accessible. It's still, you can, the ideas are all there and you can get into them. And so I wanted to do that with this book. And when I tried to do it, my editor, Becky, who's a great editor, my English editor, said, "What the hell are you talking about? It's like these mathematical symbols. I don't know these symbols. I don't know what they mean. I don't know why you're talking about them. I don't really know what you're saying about them." It just didn't work. I wasn't able, with that content, to split the difference. And so it sort of forced a choice. It's like, okay, is this book be primarily for people who know the math already? Or is it going to be a book for people who don't yet know the math? And we'll see if the experts find some use in it, but it's not primarily for them. And so that was, I sort of chose that path. I was like, okay, I've written books that worked for both audiences. Let's try to write one that's really, it's not that it's an easy book. It's silly. It's got jokes about the Grinch, so it's meant to be a fun book. But I don't think learning math is easy. Even the math we teach to 9-year-olds, it's weird, philosophically tricky stuff. So I wanted to take that seriously as a subject, and to do that, it meant I wanted to kind of, especially in the structure, right? You're asking about, like, I didn't want to hide the ball. I didn't want to play little games and be like, this chapter is called synonyms, but then you get 2 pages in and you find out it's about fractions, because fractions are, 1/2 and 2/4 are synonyms. It's like, well, that is what I want people to take away from it, but I don't want to, I want someone who is a little unsure about math. Some of you may be a parent their kid is starting to hit a level of math they're not comfortable with. I want them to be able to pick up the book and know what page to go to find out about fractions. So that meant the structure wound up being, the language metaphor is still there, but even I'm calling it a metaphor. The language,
approach.
Framework, yes, approach,
framework,
is still there. But but I wanted it to be navigable. And so what I wound up doing, I've told Juha this, but for this book, very different from my other books, which were very top-down. I sort of okay, here's the premise for the book. Here are what the sections should be. Here are the chapters within those sections. And then I'd go do my research and find little facts about the chapter. But it was very top-down. This one, I felt like I needed to hit a reset button. So every morning as I was doing the draft, I would sit down and be like, okay, if this book ended in 800 words from now, if I could only write another few pages, and that's when the book ends, what's the most important thing to tell people about math? What's the lesson I would want to give them? And then I would write that, and then the next day I'd do it again. So it's what a mathematician would call the greedy algorithm of you just, day by day, you sort of without thinking about the big picture, you just take a step in the direction that seems best right now. And then when I finished, I went back and cleaned it up a little bit. Unified it and filled in some gaps. But that was the writing method, which was very different than my other books. That's not, it didn't come naturally to me to write that way. But it was fun to do something different.
Well, I think it's a lot of fun, and it's certainly different. I haven't read a math book like this before, so thank you. So I think now we have a few minutes for questions, or comments. Does somebody have something to say? I could bring you this microphone. Just a second.
Thanks, Juha.
Let's see if I can do it.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. It's always fun for me to get to kind of tap into a different conversation about education, different community with its own thoughts.
Oh, hey, yeah, thanks for the really interesting conversation here. One thing I was wondering is that you talked about how math is kind of like a language you only speak in a classroom. And, I mean, math always just comes up at some point in daily life, in some way, or kind of masked in some other context. But do you see a way, or how do you kind of consider it, outside of the, just reading popular books on mathematics, that we could kind of maybe socially see math becoming less of a thing that's done in a classroom and more of a thing that we could actually kind of enjoy as a kind of like a cultural experience? Do you see some other avenues other than popular books as way, or for instance, as kind of like Pi Day type of celebrations, as a way for us to be able to see math in a different way and kind of see it and speak of it in lessons as something you learn in the classroom and more as something that you can actually do in your daily life?
Yeah. No, thanks. That's a good question. Yeah. I think I don't think I have a single big insight about that, but I see different work that various people are doing. That shares that goal. So, one direction to go is sort of mathematical art, where there's lots of interesting things you can do with patterns and with, cool tilings of, that capture different kind of geometric properties. And you see it in crafts too, like quilt work or knitting. You sort of can have interesting mathematical patterns. So that's one way to reach people in a place that they maybe are more comfortable with, or more they're starting with greater curiosity. So I think, I see different sort of math outreach programs focusing on art, I think is a cool way to do it. I think there's also toys and games are a good place. The fact that the Rubik's Cube, which is a pretty sophisticated object, right? It's not an easy one to solve, right? I think when Erno Rubik was pitching it to toy publishers, they were like, we can't, what? Like, you need to be a math professor to solve this thing. This is not, and then it sold 500 million copies around the world. It's one of the most popular toys ever. So yeah, toys and puzzles and games are a good one. That's actually it's only in English. The third book I did was a book of like pencil and paper games, and so that was sort of my move in that direction a little bit. I try to give some, and I chose the games to be fun to play, not just to teach a mathematical lesson. Because we play games in the classroom that are like that, where it's polynomial dominoes or something. It's like, do you really want to play that, or is that? So I try to choose ones that are really fun. So there's that, and then of course math. You're right, in some sense, the artistic side of math plays a little bit more to how mathematicians like to think of the subject, which is as its own beautiful pursuit, that's not narrowly about scientific uses. But also math is really useful for science. So I think there's, some of the popular science press does a good job of bringing in mathematics. I think it can be hard. I think even a lot of science journalists aren't always comfortable with some mathematics, certainly not with research mathematics. But I think that's sort of another avenue to bring in mathematical ideas, because I think people I find the average person on the street is often a little more curious about like the cosmos than they are about the irrationals. And like they're a little curious about the irrationals, but sort of if math can kind of hitch its wagon with, biology and astronomy, that tends to be a good way to get interesting ideas out there.
Yeah, hello, and thanks for the funny conversation and good poetry in Finnish too. I would like to return for a moment to the Finnish kid who got a fail for his commutative mistake. It was explained that because the problem was given in Finnish text, like in written text.
Yeah.
That because the problem was like Peter buys 5 tickets of 9 euros, you must put the solution in 5 times 9, not 9 times 5. So it was actually a translation mistake that was implied. But it's not a translation, because you can speak math in both ways. Have you any thought on this?
Yeah, I've occasionally heard from, I guess mostly from primary educators, exactly that claim, that if you have a statement, right, like that, like I bought 5 tickets for 9 euros each, that somehow to translate that into mathematics, there's kind of one, right, that it has to be 5 times 9, or it has to be 9 times 5. But I can't remember which one of those it is, because that's not a convention that I think professional mathematicians would recognize. So yeah, and it's tricky, because sometimes there are places in education where you want to have some kind of rule or convention for learners, even if experts don't really rely on that rule anymore. It can be still a useful scaffold. But I agree, I don't think this is one where you need a rule. Like, if you buy 5 tickets for 9 euros each, it's really fine to write that as 5 times 9 or 9 times 5. So that's one where I appreciate the details on what exactly the issue was. But yeah, I'm with you that I think there isn't such a convention in math.
Yeah, hello. Forgive me my English. It's this subject is quite complicated to explain exactly in English for me. But
well, I appreciate it.
In the beginning, I would like to say that mathematics if we think that it is a language, for me it's some kind of system to explain people, like me, for example, abstractive things. It's a system. But to call it language is a bit difficult for me to understand now, that it could be that too.
Yeah.
The purpose is the same. Language have the purpose to explain, to give shape for abstractions.
Yeah.
To make it real, to make it sensible. But anyway, would you like to say what is the difference between language and maths? Is there any differences?
Yeah. No, thanks for the question. I think I think you expressed the thought very well. I think yes, there's, and you're right to say there is more to math than language. One of the things I talk about a little bit at the beginning of the book, but that math is this world of abstract ideas. And they're very hard to access, those ideas. Sometimes we can do it with little visual manipulatives or by scribbling on a chalkboard, but to a large degree, the only access we have to that world is through our language. And so you're quite right that the language is not everything. To say math is just a language would be to miss this strange world the language is talking about. So I think that's quite right. And maybe math, maybe some parts of philosophy are similar in that we can sort of only access those ideas through our language about them. But it's something that separates math from, say, biology or physics or chemistry, the physical sciences, where you can actually get out a microscope and see a cell, or you can get out a telescope and look at a planet. But you can't, in math, the language is the microscope, the language is the telescope. We can't see an integral. We can draw a graph, we can write an integral, but we can't, there's no sensory access to it. And so the language plays an unusually central role in mathematics. But that said, I think you're quite right to say the language is not the entirety of the subject. That language is talking about something. And I think especially for mathematicians who speak the language fluently, once you speak a language fluently, you don't think about it very much. So for a working mathematician, the language is not really that central to the experience. They're just using it as a doorway to the ideas.
Okay. One more comment. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the possibility. No. Anyway, the space of the universe can be explained with mathematics also. But when you give the meaning of it, you disappear it too. Because it is something we cannot not see. We don't have any senses to see the whole thing. But we can make a shape for ourselves. But there is millions and millions of different things which are disappearing still. And we don't see the whole picture. Language is exactly the same. It's almost the impossible to explain everything so that we see the whole thing.
Yeah, I think I don't have much to add to that. No. Yeah. Thank you for the thought.
Okay, so I think we've done talking for now, and Ben will sign his books there. There is also a discount for the ones if you want to buy more than one, and you will draw your signature.
Oh yes,
figures.
Yeah, of course,
then?
always. The signature comes with a stick figure, and you can choose either an animal of your choice. Ideally, a dog or a cat. Those are the ones I can draw. My birds are wretched. I really can't draw birds, but I'll try for you if that's what you want. Or a face expressing some kind of emotion, if you'd like an excited face. Or sometimes people want a confused or an angry face. I'll draw that. I won't question that if that's your preference.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for being here.
Ben will be there. Thanks.
Yes.
Great, let's go.
Ratification of your translation of the...
Yeah.